Okay, so again, our aim for today is how do we evaluate trig inverses or trigonometric inverses. For the do now, it was for what values of theta between 0 and 2 pi does sine theta equal root 2 over 2, part A, and then part B is sine theta equals negative root 2 over 2. So I want you to solve the angles. At this point, hopefully you came up with an answer, so please begin typing in the chat your responses to the do now. So which angle gives us a sine value of root 2 over 2? And then which angle gives us a sine value of negative root 2 over 2? Okay, so we have 45 degrees from Mohammed, and then 45, 315 from Zenbin. Tolver says 45, 315. Alice, 45, 135. Okay, good. Good responses. So, yeah, we have Chris. Okay, good. Yeah, so very good, very good. Let me just go over them for the sake of time. So part A, it's going to be 45 degrees and 135. It's right here. And then for part B, it's 5 pi over 4 and 7 pi over 4. Okay. So pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4, that's 45 degrees and 135 degrees. That will give us a sine value of root 2 over 2. Then for part B, sine of 5 pi over 4 and sine of 7 pi over 4 gives us negative root 2 over 2. Okay, so let me write that in here. So quadrant 1, that's 45 degrees right here. And then quadrant 2, 135. And then for part B, it was in quadrants 3 and 4, right? Because sine is negative there. So that'll be here and here. So this will be 225. This will be 315 here on the right. And then here is 45. Here's 135. Okay. All right. Does anyone still need the solution here? Please type in the chat or speak up. No. Okay. I'm going to move on then. Okay. So the lesson today is just about, the various components. We're going to first talk about the notation of inverse trig functions, and then we'll talk about the domain and range of inverse trig functions. Okay. All right. First question for you all. Here I wrote the answer. So in a normal class, I would have you discuss, but because we're only on 25 minutes together, I'll just tell you the answer. So first question is, what might be another way to ask for the value of the angle theta in the do now? The answer to that is this, right? So here's the notation. So sine to the negative first power of negative root 2 over 2. So sine to the negative first power, the way you want to say that or pronounce that is inverse sine. So that's inverse sine of root 2 over 2. Another way you can say that is arc sine of root 2 over 2. Okay. So please copy this down, this highlighted part. Okay, so inverse sine of root 2 over 2 or arc sine of root 2 over 2. Okay, that's the notation for asking for the angle, that gives us a sine value of this number. Okay, so inverse sine and arc sine, that's how you say the inverse function of sine. Okay. All right, as a follow-up to that, note that since there are two answers depending on the quadrant, right? Because, in the do now for part A, we saw 45 and 135. For part B, we saw 225, 315. Since there are two answers, this is not a function because if you think back to September, right, the functions lesson, if there are two outputs for one input, right? So like for an orange to have two different prices, that wouldn't make any sense, right? Likewise, this arc sine function currently, right? It's not a function because we came out with two answers for root 2 over 2, right? 45, 135. Same thing for negative root 2 over 2, right? So as it is, this is not a function, but we're going to do something to make it into a function. Okay. Does anyone still need this? Please speak up or type in the chat. Yes, you should copy the highlighted part. So arc sine of root 2 over 2. So I just want you to know the notation. So sine to negative, sine to negative first power, or inverse sine of root 2 over 2, or arc sine. Okay. Yeah, everyone done though? Okay, I'm gonna move on then. All right, so yeah, as I said, right, this is not a function currently, but we're gonna make it into a function by limiting the range, okay? So you don't have to copy this down, just keep that in mind. We're gonna limit the range, okay? So for the do now, right, like the outputs were 45 degrees and 135 for part A. We're gonna limit the range, so that means we're gonna limit the possible y values that are accepted, okay? And with that, let me ask you this follow-up question. Okay, so for arc sine, what should we set the domain and range to be? Okay, so think about that for a sec. So for the domain, let me give you a hint. So if you remember inverse functions, right? So if a function has an inverse function, then the domain and range switch. Okay. So because we're talking about the inverse function of sine here, the domain of the inverse function of sine would be the range of sine. Okay, I'll say that again. So the domain of the inverse function of sine would be the range of the sine function. Okay, so think about the range of the sine function. What are the possible y values for sine? That's going to be the domain. And then for the range, we're going to limit the range. So think about which quadrants would give us both negative and positive values for sine. So if you're stuck, that's okay. We'll talk about it. But yeah, if you have an answer, feel free to type something in the chat. Afrin?
So then should the domain be -1 to 1?
Domain is yeah, good. Domain is going to be -1 to 1. Very nice. Yeah. Did anyone come up with the answer to the range? Like which quadrants give us a positive value for sine, and which quadrants give us a negative value for sine? We're going to choose two of them, okay, and then to allow for both negative and positive values. Jocelyn?
Wait, I have a question. Why is it -1? Wait, why? Why is it that?
Wait, Afrin, you want to explain?
Yeah, so when we like put the inputs for the x values for the sine function, which the range is, or sorry, the period is usually 0 to 2 pi, and when you graph it with like the value 0, like 0 pi over 2 pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, the only values you can get are -1, 0, 1. I'm sorry, 0, 1, 0, -1, 0, and then I think 1 again. But yeah, and any value between those.
Good. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let me just get to the answer then. Okay. So please copy this down. So for arc sine, the domain is going to be -1 to 1, right? Because the range of sine is -1 to 1, right? So because the inverse function undoes what the function does, right? We'll accept the y values for sine and then plug that into inverse sine, and then that'll output the angle, right? Because normally, right, for sine, the inputs are angles, and the output is some value between -1 to 1. But for arc sine, right, it's reversed, right? So for arc sine, we accept a value, and then we output an angle. Okay. All right, and then for the range, right, we have -90 to 90, right, or negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, because this will give us both quadrant 1 and quadrant 4, where sine is positive and negative respectively. Okay, so I'll draw that here. So that will look like this, right? So quadrant 1 is here, right, where sine is positive, and then quadrant 4, sine is negative, right? So this will give us, possible angles, both negative and positive angles. Because we need to, sine is, as we know, can be both positive and negative, so we need to account for that.
Mr. Liang,
Yes.
couldn't sine also be positive and negative respectively in quadrants 2 and 3?
Yeah, it could also be 2 and 3 also. But conventionally, yeah, we'll just work with quadrant 1 and quadrant 4.
Okay.
But yeah, technically we could also do quadrant 2 and 3. Okay, does anyone still need to copy this down? No? Okay, gonna move on then. All right, follow-up question. So I want you to evaluate the following really quickly. So arc sine of root 3 over 2, arc sine of negative root 3 over 2, and then arc sine of 5 over 4. Okay, take like 20 seconds, answer that. Okay, so if you have a response to this, then please type in the chat. Tell me what your answers are. Okay, we got pi over 3 from Michelle for part A. Good, so that'll be 60 degrees, right? We have 60, 300, and then undefined from Afrin. 60, negative 60 undefined from Sarjona. Okay, 60, negative 60 undefined from Christoph. Okay, good. Yeah, let me just confirm that. So let me scroll up to the answers. All right, it's right here. Okay, so yeah, for part A, right, we're gonna say 60 degrees or pi over 3, right? And you can always like check, right? So sine of 60 degrees would give us root 3 over 2. Okay, so arc sine of root 3 over 2 gives us 60 degrees. Okay, so remember, right, the input of arc sine is a value and the output is an angle. Okay, so the output of arc sine or any inverse trig function is an angle. Okay, for part B, it's going to be negative 60 degrees or negative pi over 3. Note that 300 degrees is also at the same location as negative 60, but remember the range we want is between negative 90 and 90 inclusive. So we would preferentially say negative 60 degrees here. Yeah, so technically 300 degrees would be incorrect, but like I know what you mean, but yeah, just say negative 60 degrees here for part B. Part C is undefined, for which I write just the null set. So this a 0 with a cross, like a strike through it, is the null set. You could also just say undefined here. So arc sine of 5 over 4. So for that, you have to think like sine of what angle gives us 5 over 4 or 1.25, right? The answer would be no value, right? It's invalid because we know that the possible outputs for sine, right? They go up to 1, right? So 1 is the maximum value for sine, right? So this be undefined, right? And you can also just like remember the domain. The domain of arc sine or inverse sine is -1 to 1, right? And 5 over 4, 1.25, is over a value of 1, right? That's greater than 1. So that would be undefined. Okay. All right. Does anyone still need a copy of this solution here?
Wait, I have a question. Wait, so why does it have to be? Well, I understand why it has to be pi over 3, but like, why can't it be like 150? Is it because the range?
You're talking about part A?
Yeah, or part A.
Well, 150 degrees,
Range.
yeah, we're talking about the range.
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
So 150 degrees, that would be over 90 degrees, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so we just limited the range. Technically, like, sine 150, or it'll be sine 120 degrees here, right?
Oh, oops. Oh, okay,
Sine
okay.
120 would give us root 3 over 2.
Okay.
But yeah, we just limit the range, so. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next slide. And this next slide is just about the other inverse trig functions. Okay, so here we have the domain range of the inverse sine, cosine, and tangent functions. So the first row is what you already have, right, for arc sine, and then for arc cosine, the domain is also -1 to 1 because the range of cosine, the range of the inverse function of inverse cosine, so the range of cosine was -1 to 1, right? So that would be the possible inputs for inverse cosine. The range is going to be different for arc cosine because, right, so if you think about it, inverse cosine, right, we need to consider positive and negative values, right? So cosine is positive in quadrant 1 and negative in quadrant 2, right? So that would be 0 to pi here. And then for tangent, or inverse tangent, the domain is -infinity to infinity, right? Because the range of tangent is -infinity to infinity, right? If you remember the graph, it goes like this, right? So all possible values there are for the domain of inverse tangent. For the range of inverse tangent or arctangent, it'll also be quadrants 1 and 4. Because tangent and every other trig function is positive in quadrant 1, so there we get the positive values. And then quadrant 4, tangent is negative, so we get the negative values, or the negative angles, right? Okay, is anyone still copying this slide here? Speak up or type in the chat. No, everyone have it? Okay, all right, you guys copy fast. So for the rest of the class, it's just the worksheet. So if you go on Google Classroom, you can see the worksheet, but also scroll. So there's about 4 minutes left in class, so try to answer, let's say, the first 4 questions. So I'll be right here. Yep. Here's the worksheet. So yeah, see if you can answer the first 4 questions. If you can answer all of them, that's great. But yeah, we have about 3 minutes left, so we'll go over them pretty soon. Yeah, try to answer the first 4. I mean, if you can answer all 8, then yeah, go ahead. But we're gonna go over the solutions in like a minute or so. Okay, so I'm gonna go over the solutions. Sorry if you're not done yet. Want to ensure that we get through the answers. Okay, for question 1, it was arc cosine of negative root 3 over 2. That will be 5 pi over 6 or 150 degrees. For question 2, it's arc tan of root 3. That's pi over 3 or 60 degrees. For question 3, it's arc tan of negative root 3. That will be negative pi over 3 or negative 60 degrees. For question 4, it's arc cosine of root 2 over 2, which is pi over 4 or 45 degrees. Next, we have arc sine of negative 1/2, which is negative 30 degrees or negative pi over 6. Question 6, we have arc cosine of root 3 over 2, which is pi over 6 or 30 degrees. Question 7, we have arc tan of 1, which is pi over 4 or 45 degrees. And then question 8, we have arc tan of root 3 over 3, which is pi over 6 or 30 degrees. All right, and you can always, use your calculator to answer these. And also as a check, you can also just like reverse it, right? So like cosine of 5 pi over 6, right? Cosine of 150 degrees is equal to negative root 3 over 2, right? So you just like do the reverse operation. Okay. Okay, so for closing announcements, let me just say that okay, so again, for quiz 3, if you didn't leave a private comment on Google Classroom regarding like which questions you want me to regrade, please do so as soon as possible. Just letting me know like which questions you want me to regrade for partial credit. And yeah, let me know if you have multiple uploads of pictures, then let me know which questions work is on each picture. Okay, so please do that as soon as possible on Google Classroom. Most of you already done it, so thank you for that. But yeah, some of you haven't yet. So if you want partial credit, please do so as soon as possible. Secondly, there is SGI in 7 minutes. Drop by if you have questions. And then third, there's the extra credit homework that's due tonight. So yeah, just FYI, that's 3 out of 2 points on People Path. So yeah, please do that if you're looking to raise your grade. Okay. Okay. But yeah, that's all I want to say for today. If you have no further questions, you're free to go, and I'll see you all tomorrow. All right. Take care.
Have a good day.